Hello, listeners, and welcome to Season 3 of the Cold Vault podcast. I'm your host, Kacey, and I wanted to update this introduction to offer a few additional trigger warnings about upcoming content. As you likely know, this is a podcast about cults, extremism, coercive control, and abuses of all types. A platform for survivors and victims to share their experiences, change misconceptions, and help advocate for and educate others. Given the recent election results in America and the nature of upcoming interview themes, I wanted to remind listeners that each episode comes with a content warning for themes of murder, abuse and harm, and abortion rights and restrictions. Please take care when listening to each installment. Self-care practices may include being outside for walks or gardening or leaning into friends and family and loved ones, or participating in an activity that brings you joy, like a trip to the cinema, or exercise, or taking a nap. Whatever self-care looks like to you, be sure to practice these things when listening to this material and any other material like this. For early access to ad-free episodes, you can find me on patreon.com/thecultvault for as little as £1 a month. Thank you so much for my patrons for being such a beacon of support, and I look forward to our monthly video call catch-ups at the end of each month. Lastly, I'm so very excited for my favourite weekend of the year in June 2025, CrimeCon UK in London on the 7th and 8th of June. Partnered with True Crime, this is going to be the biggest and busiest and best CrimeCon UK to date, with expert speakers, survivors and advocates of justice taking to the stage to discuss their work in the field of true crime. It's the UK's biggest true crime event, and it's jam-packed with talks and events throughout the weekend, with the most flexible ticket options available, including day tickets, night tickets, weekend tickets, concessions, and different options for payment plans available now at crimecon.co.uk. I will be at the event. I'm so glad that I've been invited back again, and hopefully you will see me up on the big stage. And I look forward to seeing you all there. Head to crimecon.co.uk and use the code CULT, C-U-L-T, at the checkout for 10% off your ticket. And patrons, you can contact me for an additional reduction in ticket prices. Now, on to today's show. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Cult Vault podcast. I'm your host, Kacey, and today I am going to be interviewing somebody that I have been in book club with for a while, but somebody whose book I've only just managed to finish reading. I'm so excited to introduce everybody to Annie. It's nice and early where you are, so hopefully we can brush off some of that morning fogginess and ask you if you would like to introduce yourself to the listeners.
Sure. Annie Dawid. This is my 6th book, Paradise Undone. I have it here to show you. Can you see that okay?
I can. Yes, it's a great cover.
Thank you. The cover's done by a Bay Area American artist named Joe Sam, and he was in the Bay Area when the Jonestown massacre happened, and he did a series of drawings, I don't know, a couple dozen, and selected that one for the cover, and he graciously agreed. And I feel like the cover shows that how all these human beings get lost in this crowd behind the leader, Jim Jones. And so my task with the book was to illuminate some of those lives, to differentiate them out of this nameless mass that the cover depicts, which is how the world's media showed the whole world what was going on in Jonestown. And it didn't understand, and 46 years later, practically, it still barely understands what happened at Jonestown and to whom.
Paradise Undone feels like a fictional non-fiction book, which is kind of like a contradicting thing to say. But there are definitely some parts in the book that are real. Lots of quotes from Jim Jones, lots of segments of news articles, and then parts of the book that are kind of fictionalized elements of storylines from different people that would have experienced Jim Jones in the earlier days from Louisiana into kind of building the People's Temple and up to California, and then all the way over to Guyana, and how the whole event of Jonestown unfolded, and then the aftermath as well of the Jonestown massacre, which I think is a really important part to highlight. And there's so much in this book, and I just don't even know where to begin with asking you on how you picked this story and how you wrote it. But maybe we should start by asking, why did you choose to retell the story of Jonestown, and specifically through fiction?
Yes. So I started this book in 2004, which is 20 years ago, and I had just done a writers' conference at the University of North Dakota, where I had been invited as master teacher, and I gave a reading while I was there to this enormous crowd. I think it was the biggest crowd I'd ever had, 600 people. And I read from a long short story that I had very recently finished about this family who is experiencing, it's a New York Jewish family, and it's experiencing September 11th, which wasn't very long ago at the time. And this family was based on a family I knew growing up in New York. And there's one tiny part of this story that mentions Jonestown, and it's incidental and kind of by the way, but not entirely, because the family has two daughters who have disappeared into a cult in the 1980s. Nothing to do with Jonestown, just this kind of little homegrown American cult without a name even. And the parents go to a deprogrammer and try to get him to take on their case to get their daughters out, which happens, but it isn't unsuccessful. Get the daughters out. But the deprogrammer says to them, listen, before we go any further, you should know I had a daughter who died in jail. And so after the reading, so that's the only mention of Jonestown in this very long story that I read. And then afterwards, the organizer comes up to me in tears. And that's a very powerful response from somebody in the audience. It's never happened to me before or since, I think. And he says, you know, I have good friends who had family died, and that was intense. And they were colleagues of his. I'd never met them, never heard of them. And so I kind of filed that away. And then a few months later, I was preparing for my second sabbatical, that I was going to spend a whole year writing. And I had a plan to start this book I'd been thinking about called Hippie Ruins, about these two old communes in southern Colorado. And I had been to these communes. I had friends there. I had lots of stories. And so I was at the bookstore, Undersea, great used bookstore in Portland, Oregon. The CO commune where I was looking, lots of books. And then I kind of made my way down. And then I have what I call my bookstore aisle epiphany. There's CU books. And look, there's all these books about Jonestown. So many books about Jonestown. And I'm standing there looking at those books, which honestly look more interesting than the copying books. And I think I'm remembering my friend and his tears and his deeply being moved by the his friend's experience, not his own. But I thought, I'm going to write about Jonestown because it felt more urgent and necessary to tell that. Like the hippie Tommies are a good story, and they could wait. There's nothing urgent about it. It's still waiting, by the way. And so that's the moment that I started to think about Jonestown as the very, very important subject that it is. And I should say 20 plus years later, or exactly 20 years later, the people that he mentioned are now people I know very well, and they are the head of the Jonestown Institute, Dr. Rebecca Moore and Fielding McGee, who are the go-to people in the entire universe for information about Jonestown. They have extensive online articles. So that was the beginning. I was 18 when Jonestown happened, and I remember it very, very well. I was a college freshman at the University of Vermont, and I was in I think it was a Religions of the World class, and uh, and the professor came in, and he was mortified, and he was telling us about what had happened in Jonestown over the weekend. And we were all completely stunned. And it was, how could all these people commit suicide? And of course, now I know, and the world's beginning to know, it wasn't a mass suicide. It was a mass murder, and there were some people who committed suicide as well. So that was the beginning of the Jonestown novel. Now, why did I write fiction? Because I'm a fiction writer. And I did study journalism in college, so I have a journalist in me too. And when I started doing research in 2004, there were no American novels about Jonestown. There were of nonfiction books of all kinds from multiple disciplines. And Dr. Moore has written a number of books herself in the religious studies field about Jonestown. I read it and read. I ordered books from all over the world. At the time, I was living off the grid in a cabin with my 4-year-old at 91 Teacher Feet, and I guess I'm a bitch in that. So at the time, all my research was print, so it was all books. So there were no American novels, and I thought at the time, I'm going to write the first American novel. And so were there no American novels because it's such a horrific, difficult subject that there's an attitude of this, why would you write fiction about something that there's so much factual information about it? But fiction has other strengths. And among them, or principally among them, the ability to imagine oneself into real life people who were there. And so that's what I did. I ultimately chose 4 protagonists, and 2 of them were real people who were dead, so I could write about them without dishonoring their living memory. Mrs. Jim Jones, the wife of Jim Jones, who was there from the very beginning, and without whom there would not have been a People's Temple, because she was a super workhorse. And then I also chose the Guyanese ambassador to the United States, although I didn't use his real name in the story. And then the other two characters, an African American man and a white American woman, and they're composite characters. I read lots and lots of memoirs because that's another genre that is well represented. Lots of memoir. So I made those two up, and the other two were real, but there was hardly anything about Mrs. Jim Jones, and that drove me crazy. I mean, she was so crucial to the story. And she's like, oh, the woman behind the man. She's not important, but she's really important.
You managed to really creatively capture the political and racial climate of certain parts of America and South America during certain parts of your book. And I wonder if you could talk us through how you were able to develop African American or Black characters in your book when you are a white woman. Did you have any help in shaping those characters, and how were you able to stay true to what Black Americans were experiencing in America in that time in history?
Well, first, let me say, I hope I stay true to that. I don't know. I haven't had any feedback that says otherwise. And I've had a lot of Black readers. So that's encouraging to me. I did end up listening to interviews and watching interviews, which some of which were available. There were a few documentaries at that time, although the kind of the best documentary is a public television documentary that came out in maybe 2007, and that was later in my process. But that was also directed by an African American director, and I'm not going to remember Stanley Nelson. I think it's his name. I always get Nelson Stanley Nelson. I think that's it. And like the directors of the Jonestown Institute, and many people kind of consider that the best, fairest look at Jonestown, because there's been a lot of documentaries since, and some of them are really sensationalized and horrible. Like the coverage was at the time from the general media. I want to show you a picture. Can you see that? It's called the.
Oh my goodness.
So this is a Newsweek, which is at the time a major news magazine, weekly, and there's all the bodies on the ground, and that is kind of what everybody saw at the time. Also on TV, like they had news crews that went out there, and it's just all these bodies, and they're most and not one of them is given a name, a history, a life. And so perhaps I would say it's not surprising that it was an African American director who did the best job thus far. I don't want to say there could be more that are coming that gives life to those individuals. So, anyway, what I meant to say was I listened to the voices and watched some of the African American survivors being interviewed, and I tried to just be a good observer. which I think all good fiction writers are good observers. And also, I wanted to add, I keep saying there hadn't been an American novel in 2004, and that's true, but there was a novel written by a Guyanese British writer from the 1990s, and his name is Wilson Harris, and the book is called Jonestown. And that comes at it from a very Guyanese perspective. And of course, I read that because I could get my hands on it, and it's a powerful piece of work, but it's definitely not the American version of the story. And so I thought I could still contribute that. Now, of course, it took so many years to get the book published that there have been American novels published now about Jonestown. So, not the first, which is okay. But there haven't been a lot of novels. It's still mostly nonfiction that you can find. History, journalism, psychology, new religious studies, cultural approaches. And now there's the sort of cult education world, which you know very intimately, having just finished your program. In Coaches Control, though, that's the only program in the world that does that, and it's in the UK. I know it; you can do it online, but there hasn't been an American program like that, which is curious, and there are so many American folks. But so there's still not a lot of fiction writers taking it on, and it may be in part because it's such a complicated and difficult story. So I hope that answers.
It does, and I think that it's strange for me to go into a conversation without asking about the cult in question. And I know that Jonestown and the events of Jonestown, and sometimes there's conversations about the lead up to the move over to establishing Jonestown as well, even though most of the conversations take place once the cult is established in South America. I think I haven't even asked you to tell us what Jonestown is, or who Jim Jones was, or how he established such a significant following, and why it's such an important question to talk about the racial segregation at the time, the political, social, and racial politics in parts of America at that time, and what Jim Jones was perceived to do for African American or Black communities on a political front, but actually how he exploited those vulnerabilities on the back end. So I don't know if there's a way that you could just summarize all of those things for us.
I can do a couple of things here. There are many people in the world who've been studying Jonestown for 46 years, so I'm just going to break off a little bit of the iceberg here. I believe that the People's Temple, which is the name of the Greek in the United States, and started in Indiana in the 1950s, which was a time of high racial segregation in the United States. Jim Jones is white. His wife is white. And he wanted to break barriers and bring Black and white people together in church. So he was a minister. So that was his milieu. And Marshallin thought that was exactly the right thing to do. She was a nurse, and she worked with Black and white people in her hospital. So he was, or they were, ahead of the civil rights movement in many ways. They also adopted many kids across racial lines, which was a brand new thing to do in Indiana in the 1950s as well. And it was a Christian church. He had been ordained in the Disciples of Christ. So we had this sort of mainstream legitimacy. And they started with a very small church called Wings of Deliverance. And guess what? Black and white people wanted to worship together. So their congregation grew, and then they got a bigger church. And that's how it began. They did social justice kinds of activities that are very admirable and were admirable then, like soup kitchens, helping the elderly with getting them to their medical care and helping them navigate the bureaucracy of insurance, which over here it may be more complicated than it is. They were doing good things for their community. And on one hand, the community of the larger community of white people were not thrilled at this invitation to blocks of integration and equality. So they got threats. And at the time, Indiana was the was the headquarters of the KKK. It wasn't the South, it was the Midwest, which not everybody knows that. And but also they were welcomed at the same time by the Black community for their efforts. They located the church in the Black community, and they started integrating restaurants by the Jones would go to the restaurant owner and say, "Hey, I'm going to bring in a big crowd of people, and you're going to get a full restaurant." And so the owner said, "Well, we like that." And so that was before the lunch counter boycotts began in the United States in 1960. So he was the head of the game. And then he got awarded with some sort of, I don't know, Humanitarian of the Year award for the Human Rights Committee by Indianapolis government. So he got mainstream recognition at the time. And so they did good things. They eventually moved out to Northern California in the 60s, and that was a completely different environment and a different time. And the church greatly expanded there and eventually started attracting a lot of white college students or college educated people. He did bring about 100 families with him from Indiana, and they were both Black and they were white and they were poor and they were working class. But it wasn't the sort of intellectual white circle that kind of came to be more associated with the People's Temple. So in Northern California then, and it's the 60s, and people are idealistic and wanting the world to change. And so the church got bigger, but it was really kind of continuing the mission that started of social justice. And they also had a very successful program to get people off of drugs. And so a lot of people joined that way of all sorts of populations where they got clean. And then they stayed with the church somewhat in gratitude and somewhat, well, this is a good gig here. And the outside world wasn't doing very much for me. Here I can be of use. And so they grew and they grew, and then they got churches in San Francisco and Los Angeles. So then it became a much more urban movement than it had been before. So all of this is pre-Jonestown, and they started what is called the People's Temple Agricultural Mission. They started building it in Guyana in 1974. The Dutch are in 1978. So there's a 4-year period there where most of the people are still in California, and a group of people, they called them the pioneers, were building the village of Jonestown from scratch, from nothing. It was pure jungle, and they cleared 300 acres of jungle, and they built a small city there, which is a very incredible thing to do. Nothing it was smart, because they ended up making lots of mistakes. But the idea is a very American idea of utopia. We're going to build a new society with new structures, and we're fleeing persecution. Or that was the fear that they would be persecuted in the U.S. So I see Jonestown as part of a very long American tradition of people, and you could say pre-United States establishment, those who fled England and the Netherlands. They were fleeing religious persecution, and then they started new communities in North America. So that was the idea, which was a beautiful idea, but like all of those attempted utopias in our history, they failed. So that's a little bite of the origin story.
Thank you so much, Annie. I don't know if you would consider yourself like a People's Temple expert at this point.
Well, I believe, but there are many who have read more, so I wouldn't call myself an expert. I'm somebody who's kind of in the study of that world and that time and place. And then also the aftermath, which you mentioned before. My book isn't just about Jonestown, it's about the survivors and the world that follows what happened in 1978 and the whole kind of cultic environment, which is still with us today.
You mentioned at the start of your book, in the acknowledgement section, there's a part where you thank the Jonestown Institute for their kind of unwavering support of your project, which is really heartwarming to hear that you're being trusted with certain resources that I imagine the Jonestown Institute have, and that they are giving their blessing to you to do this project, when I imagine they are almost inundated from different people in different parts of the world requesting certain documents and information. So I was wondering if you could just explain to the listeners who might not be aware, what is the Jonestown Institute and how much were they able to help you in putting your book together?
Well, they ended up being these lovely people whom I met and have just always been encouraging. So they went through all of my hundreds of rejections. I mean, not that I told them every time I got a rejection, that would be ridiculous, but they, they are these lovely people who are supportive of me. But I should say everything that's online is available to everyone with an internet connection. And they had been, they've been developing their online resources all these years. So now it's just almost completely, not everything is online, but almost. So I wouldn't say that I had a special advantage among anyone else who might write a novel. They've just been kind and helpful all these years, because it turns out they're friends of my original friend back in North Dakota, because Becky Moore taught there, and that's how she met Jim McKenzie, who was running I don't know how far into my research I was at that point, but one day I got an email from an unknown source to me, and it said, "We hear through the grapevine you were writing a novel about Jonestown." And that was, oh my God, how is that even possible? I'm not a famous writer. This is my sixth book, but my name is virtually unknown in the United States. So that was a shocker. And then, of course, I put that together, or they put that together for me. So there have been other fiction writers now who have published work. There's an Australian novel and other American novels. So I think that they want everyone, including artists, and I mean, there's been dances, there's been like every version of art that people have attempted to use while trying to understand Jonestown. So they are educators and will want people to understand, to attempt to understand what happened there. So I think that's really been their lives ultimately, is getting more information out to the public, and then new be sure or not. They were the original people who did the Freedom of Information Act to get all these documents from the FBI, because the FBI took everything from Jonestown, and there was a huge wealth of papers and also tapes, because they taped everything. So then, of course, all those, I think there was like 800 tapes or something, and so then they had to be transcribed, a lot of work, photographs where the people in the photographs need to be identified. So it's a huge labor of love on their part. And then all these Jonestown survivors have become integral to telling the stories as well, and they get interviewed all the time. So I think the ironic nature of the sign above the what they called the throne, Jim Jones's chair. It wasn't a throne, but it was a chair that was elevated. Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. The sign above all the dead bodies in the end. We have to keep studying history, and maybe one day we'll get it right if we keep studying history. So I think that's part of their mission. So the archives are located at SDSU, and so if you just type Jonestown Institute SDSU into your search, you'll get there, and the resources are truly outstanding. Anyone who wants to know more. And so their resources are not the sensationalistic, awful ones. So it's a good place to start if you want to learn more.
When you first told us about how you got sort of interested or hooked on the subject of the People's Temple as your next novel idea, you talked about ideas that came from a short story that included two young people being attempting to be deprogrammed by somebody working as, I assume, a cult expert. That's a very specific and niche thing that I feel you only really know about if you work in the cult awareness or education space. So I wondered if you could illuminate where your interest in cults and your knowledge in cults came from before you started to research the People's Temple, and also if that has played a part in you centering the victims of Jonestown at the kind of as the heart of this book, and just highlighting throughout the memory of every person that lost their life in the Jonestown massacre and those that were impacted by the ripple effect of that day, really are the motivation for your book.
Yeah. So before I started studying Jonestown in 2004, I did not know very much about cults. I had never done any cult research. I had these friends who had disappeared into a cult in about 1983. Now that's 5 years later. So they went into this nameless cult when we all knew how dangerous and deadly cults could be. And they stopped communicating with everyone, changed their names, and at that time, by the time I started my book, one of them had died. But these were sisters, okay? And one of them had died under mysterious circumstances. So all during those years, from the 80s to the 2000s, I was in touch with their mother because I cared about them and I wanted to know more. And so I learned about this attempt at the deprogrammer from her. It was tragic. It was tragic. And so by this time now, I I heard from the surviving sister who eventually got out of it. And now we are friends, and she's a writer, and I'm encouraging her to tell her story. But of course, one of the early things that we talked about was she said, I didn't know I was in a cult. 20 years plus she was in this organization. And I have since come to understand, as the saying goes, nobody joins a cult. Join an organization of people, and maybe it's for doing good works, and maybe it's for getting community from like-minded people that you don't feel elsewhere. And so that was absolutely the story with her. And so I think I probably, like a lot of people anyway in the States, where if you didn't know anyone who'd ever been in a cult and you yourself had not been in one, then your knowledge would be very superficial. And so I wanted to remedy my ignorance uh, by understanding the phenomenon more. And also these friends, these sisters, they were people very like me. They grew up in the same place, which was a suburb of New York City. They were Jewish like me. They were educated. They were creative and smart and funny, and they were not these uh, zombies that would be dead on the ground, facing the ground. The Jonestown dead were presented to the public as these, drugged out zombies or automatons who were following their leader. My friends were not like that, and it turned out the 900 plus dead were not like that either. In fact, the only drugged out person Jonestown was Jones. And that's one of the huge ironies, right? Is that he was successful in helping all these people get off drugs, that he himself was a drug addict, and nobody in his circle was successful. I don't even know if they tried in getting him off drugs. We wished that they had, or we wouldn't be here today telling the story. But he was a hardcore addict by the end, and there are a lot of experts who think he would have died soon, physically, from all of his ailments, which were completely compounded by his drugs. So that's part of my cult education story. So the deprogramming notion, which was big in the 70s and 80s, because that was really kind of the heyday of cults I mean, traditional, let's say, cults. And when I say traditional, I mean in person human beings getting together and then getting isolated from the rest of the world. Nowadays, there's plenty of cults on the internet, so they don't look like that anymore. The different kind of space for cults in the 20s.
Do you think that when you started writing this book in 2004, that there was more or less public awareness of cults than there is today? I don't know if I am just kind of experiencing my own echo chamber, as I say quite often. But it feels as though there are a lot more media pieces coming out that are focused on the subject of cults and con artistry and stalking and harassment and all things that kind of can be identified as being cult-like, or what I would say as coercive and controlling behavior. So I wonder if you can kind of uh, explore over the years if that's changed for you and how you've understood cults being in the public eye.
Yeah, well, there's definitely a huge awareness now, and that also has to do with the rise of the internet. And of course, there was an internet in 2004, but everything has become so online for good and for bad since then. So I think that um, the internet has been in service of building cults, and it has also been in service of helping people who have been in cults reach each other and help one another. And so I know, for instance, my friend, when she left in the early 2000s, there wasn't any uh, help that she got at the time. So, so now I think anyone who's in that situation can, if they have access to the internet, they can find lots of resources to help them and to help them find others, often who've left the same cult, and have strategies to how to re-enter the world. Um, I wanted to recommend a book that's called Back to the World by Eugene Smith that came out a few years ago. And he is a Jonestown survivor who has not been one of those people who talked all the time to the media and who didn't tell his story, and he kind of didn't want to deal with it all until very, very recently. So his book is a kind of new perspective. I just read it, and it was recommended to me by the Jonestown Institute as one of the best books of the last 5 years. Eugene Smith is the author, and he's an African American man, and he had been in Georgetown on the day of the massacre, and there were lots of People's Temple members who were often in Georgetown. That's the capital of Guyana. And they had a sort of an administrative branch there. And then he was working at customs at the airport for the People's Temple because they were always having supplies coming in and sometimes new people coming in. And so they had a presence at the international airport. And he was kind of an outlier, and part of what I learned from his book is that a lot of people who were troublemakers in Jonestown got sent to Guyana, got sent to Georgetown to keep them out of Jones's hair, which makes sense, and they were necessary, doing necessary work. So he was one of those people. He wasn't a kind of fawning Jones one, but he pretty much hated Jones, and there were plenty of people who hated and feared him. So I learned a lot from him, especially about what happened when he came back to the States. And then people in general hated Jonestown survivors and feared them precisely because of that idea that they were zombies and brainwashed and dangerous, right? Because all these people died. And so he did not have an easy entry back in 1978 and then subsequent decade. I think he is somebody who I don't think I wouldn't say he's kind of availed. I mean, he doesn't talk about availing himself of internet resources, but he has been in touch with other Jonestown survivors, and they have had an annual ceremony on the day of the massacre, the 18th of November, at the cemetery in Oakland, California, where there are there's uh, a mass grave from all these bodies that were not otherwise identified and taken to individual burial grounds elsewhere. So, so there that community started. That had nothing to do with the
When you were conducting your research to put this book together, what were some of the most surprising or unexpected or impactful things that you came across, and how did you go about integrating those elements into your story? I also realize now where some of the elements of one of your characters came from after you talked about Eugene Smith just then. It kind of fits in with how one of your characters is presented in terms of how he thought about Jones and things like that. So it's interesting to hear you talk about where all these inspirations came from.
Right, right. Although, as I said, Eugene Smith had just told his story. So when I wrote my book, he was not one of my resources. And like I said,
Gosh, okay.
he wasn't one of the people that interviewed all the time. So, but yeah, there are echoes though. So we learn, it was sort of, you get real life to sort of affirm some of your fiction when you get more information. So what was surprising, so most people who know about Jonestown, and very unfortunately, one of those uh, sort of touchstones is drinking the Kool-Aid, and people have this idea that drinking the Kool-Aid just means following the party line without question, which is what it has come down to mean. But it is a very disrespectful way of referencing these 900 plus people who died. It was it wasn't even Kool-Aid. It was a kind of knockoff uh, Kool-Aid, or what Eugene Smith called ghetto Kool-Aid. And they didn't all, yeah, that's a good phrase. They didn't all just drink it. They were, so this is what, one of the things that people don't know. There were people with guns, the Jones security force, who were standing around making sure that people drank it. And if they didn't drink it, they would get injected with it. And they had syringes to put it into little kids' mouths. And so those are kind of some shocking details of how some of these 900 plus people were forced into it. So, um, so because you read my book, that I talk about the resistance when it was happening by some, not by all, to this idea that death was the only way out of their problems. And that's a suicidal ideation that death will solve your problems. And Jonestown did have different kinds of problems, but of course, suicide was not the only quote unquote solution to those problems. And it did effectively end everything. And so for those people who were in the Capitol that day, and then there's a whole nother branch of People's Temple people who were back in San Francisco doing all this administrative work and shipping supplies. And there were all those people who felt so devastated, as one does when a family member commits suicide. And they were like a very large family who were then having to grieve. And our culture here in the U.S. does not give them any room or space or legitimacy to grieve that loss after it happened. And I should say, for those who don't know, a U.S. congressman who was investigating the situation at Jonestown was murdered by Jones's security force, in quotes. And that's what prompted all the U.S. government attention. No congressman before or since has been murdered doing his or her job. And that murder, as well as the murders of 3 media people, and then also one Jonestown defector who most people think was not intended to have been killed. That Jones didn't send his people out to kill the defectors. He sent them to kill the congressman and the media, whom he hated and blamed for all of his troubles, as a paranoid person is wont to do. And he was really suffering from paranoia at that point. So I wanted to make sure that the understanding that this was not all these people blindly following their leader and taking poison. That was not the majority experience. Most people want to live, and in the face of trouble will do what they can to survive. And there were many that day who felt that way, but were cornered. I don't know if this was a good moment to talk about how people get broken down, and in this case, when you are isolated, and they were so isolated from the mainstream, they couldn't just walk out, despite the fact that he said, oh, people can leave anytime in that last day interview. No, they couldn't. And if they tried to escape, they'd be hunted down and punished, which happened to some before that last day. But they were sleep deprived. So these are kind of techniques of what came to be called brainwashing. Sleep deprivation, protein deprivation, super hard work so that you're completely exhausted. And so you're physically broken down. You can't think straight, as the saying goes, because you don't have enough physical health and mental health because you're exhausted and because you're protein deprived. So that was the case. And I always say that Jonestown wouldn't have happened if they had stayed in the U.S. because they could have just gotten out on the highway and put out their bomb to escape. But that was not possible in Jonestown. There was no highway. And they were a 24-hour boat trip from the cap. So we couldn't just walk out. And also, Jones took everybody's passports and locked them away.
I think it's an incredibly difficult and poignant story that is handled so incredibly compassionately. And from what I've researched accurately, I know my research is probably 1/10 of what you've done over your kind of decades of putting this book together. And we are coming up to what I believe is the 1-year anniversary of the publication of your book, Paradise Undone. It's a whole world of perspectives and stories and information, and it's victim and survivor focused. It's an incredible book and it's very well written. It's hard to explain because we don't want to celebrate anything that happened because of Jim Jones. But what I think your book does really well is highlight and not celebrate, but give space to all of the people that were exploited and who were vulnerable and who had those vulnerabilities taken advantage of by Jim Jones as a cult leader. So I really recommend people go and pick up a copy of Paradise Undone. I know that it's online on the big online store, but I didn't know, Annie, if you wanted to tell other people about where else they might be able to find the book and where they can find your other writing as well, because you're clearly such a gifted writer.
So I don't know if you know about this site called bookfinder.com. Bookfinder.com has access to all the books available for sale everywhere in the universe. And that's how I did a lot of my research. Like I said in the beginning, it was all books. And so you can plug in Paradise Undone by Annie Dawid, and it will show you everywhere in the world where you can get the book. And there's also an electronic version, which is also available from many sources, so that you can get the book anywhere in the world, and you don't need to get it from Amazon. The only thing about Amazon that is useful from my perspective is that if you buy it from them, you can write a review. And my publisher says those reviews are crucial. I mean, reviews by anyone, anonymous reviews as well. Right, when you go to that page, don't you look at the reviews? We do. And so even if you don't buy it from them, you still can look at those reviews. So there's a multiplicity of sources where you can buy it. And also all my other books you can find on bookfinder.com as well as libraries. Not lots of libraries, sadly, but there's worldcat.com, world categories, and that will do all of the libraries where you can find books. So I did want to. I remember one thing I wanted to add, which is that about the fiction versus nonfiction idea. So the hardest part of the book was being in Marshall and Jones's head on the last day, because we don't know what she did. She was there and she died of the poison. Everyone died of the poison except for Jim Jones and his nurse, Annie Moore. And it is speculated that he asked her to kill him and then she killed herself. But we don't know that either. They could have both killed themselves. So everyone else died from the poison. So Marshall and Jones did, and she had been his wife for nearly 30 years at the time. And I had her, as I understood and perceived her character, as she's this loyal wife by training, right? She gets married in the 1940s. And although there are women who got married in the 1940s who ended up leaving their husbands, she's not one of them. And, he also, when she did want to leave him earlier, he said, "You won't get the kids. If you leave, you'll never see the kids again." And that's a big stretch. And he said, I get the best lawyers. And he did. And he probably would have succeeded in fighting her for custody at the time. So I'm not blaming her. I feel like, well, if it were me, I would have, but I don't know. So anyway, this one person who read the book said, "How could she be in Jones's head? You know, Martha Jones's head on that last day?" She said with disbelief, "But this is fiction, and that's why I write fiction. Like if it were a nonfiction book, you couldn't relate her thoughts or anybody." So I use my tools for what I know how to do. And what I try and do in all of my fiction is inhabit other human beings who are not me and try to do it with sensitivity and research when research is possible. But there was like nothing written about her. So I really did have to invent her. Now there is a documentary called The Women of Jonestown, which highlights 4 women, and she is one of them. So I would recommend people watch that It's a good documentary to learn more about her.
Just before we wrap up our conversation today, for anybody that goes through the massive process and accomplishment of writing a book and finishing a book, because I recognize that the editing stage is probably just as difficult as the writing stage sometimes. If you have a completed book and you are not finding much success on publishing your book, what are some words of motivation you can give us about this particular novel, which means you should never stop trying if you believe that your book is good enough to be out in the public world and have representation in the way your book finally did?
One of the sort of objective criteria that is useful is, so my book was a finalist in contests 17 times during the course of the 15 years of me sending it out. So first I had an agent. He tried, he failed. There were 2 almost. But for instance, one publisher who liked it said, well, the nonfiction book about Jonestown coming out. So we don't want to have 2 books about Jonestown. This was for the 2008 30-year anniversary. So I kept going with my desire to publish this story because I felt it was important. And the fact that I was a finalist, to me, said, okay, the quality of the writing is sufficient to have it rise to the top 10, and not just once, but many, many times. So that was a kind of affirmation. Okay, the book is quality. And then you get to top 10, and then it's a question of taste by the judge. So, is the judge interested in reading about the biggest loss of American civilians in the 20th century under these incredibly awful standards? Like, most likely, I don't want to spend my time with that story. So that's why I got all the top 10 rejection, I think. And I tell my students, for instance, I'm not interested in baseball. And if I were the judge, and I've been a judge many times, if I were the judge and I had 10 really good books and one of them was about baseball, I wouldn't pick it because I don't really care about baseball. So I just didn't give up. And the fact that I ended up getting published by a UK publisher makes me think, well, maybe I should have tried them in the beginning. But my reasoning, which was incorrect, was I thought this was really an American story. It's not an American story. It's an international story. Cults are all over the world, and we keep hearing horrible stories as recently as last year. And after my book came out, there in a cult massacre in eastern Kenya. And interestingly, the guy who led that cult, who is now being tried for murder, was influenced by the same American doomsday preacher, William Brannan, who was from the Midwest and who also influenced Jim Jones. So even though Brannan died in the early 60s, so there's a through line there.
Yeah, William Branham has a lot to answer for in terms of like new age, doomsday, fringe, extremist Christian sects all over the world. Every time one of these conversations comes around, his name always seems to be thrown in there somewhere. So yeah, maybe then I should do an entire episode on William Branham, so we could just actually track all of, well, we probably wouldn't be able to, but at least identify some of the most impactful cults on our society that William Branham's had a hand in influencing. But what you've just described there, Annie, is a reason why if you have a book and you believe in your book, you should never stop trying to get that book published, because even almost 20 years after the fact, you can still manage to get it into the world. And what a fantastic book it is. If any of the listeners do get hold of a copy and have a read, get in touch with me, as I always say. Let me know what you think. I've read the book, so I'd love to chat about our different kind of experiences in reading the book. And please go and leave Annie a review wherever you get your book from. And if you want me to feedback some things you thought about the book to Annie herself, let me know, because I'm happy to send that email across. And just thank you so much for your time today, Annie, getting up so early to come and chat with me, for sending me a physical copy of your book, which will stay proudly on my bookshelf, and for the enormous amount of work and compassion that went into writing Paradise Undone. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much. You're a great interviewer, and I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to speak with you and your listeners.
Enjoy the rest of your day, Annie, and let's keep in touch.